Greetings all, Ferrariman601 here. Welcome to another 1/400 scale model aircraft review of these two wonderful models of the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar made by NG Models. The L-1011, it is remembered as probably the best civil jet ever produced. Unfortunately, it is also remembered as one of the worst commercial failures in the history of civil aviation. The Lockheed L-1011, designed and built by Lockheed in the late 1960s and early 1970s, it was Lockheed's attempt to enter the jet age in terms of civil aviation. Lockheed, of course, a manufacturer of military aircraft and later on of spacecraft. However, they really never were a player in the civil aviation market, and certainly not in the jet age. The L-1011 was their first and only foray into the civil jet market, and it was an engineering triumph. However, due to a slew of delays in production both from Lockheed and from their engine supplier Rolls-Royce, unfortunately they missed the call to enter civil service when they did, and they lost out to competitors, namely McDonnell Douglas and their DC-10. However, due to a slew of technological innovations that the L-1011 introduced, it became a favorite aircraft of pilots, flight crew, and passengers alike, and to this day, despite only one L-1011 still remaining in active service in 2020, it remains a favorite among aviation fans. The L-1011 done in 1/400 here by NG. Absolutely wonderful. We have two variants of the L-1011 shown here. The Eastern Airlines livery aircraft is the launch spec L-1011-1. The United Airlines livery variant is the L-1011-500, which was the last variant of the L-1011 produced. Some slight differences between these two aircraft and some big differences in terms of their overall flight capabilities, but 90% the same airplane, I would say, and certainly they are wonderful examples of not only 1/400 scale models, but wonderful examples of the brilliant aircraft that was the Lockheed L-1011. We're going to take a look at both of these models here, show you some of the more intricate details thereof, and talk about the history and design of the L-1011, why it was such a technical triumph, but also why it was such a commercial failure, quite unfortunately. Let's take a look at both of these. Firstly, a look at the boxes of both of these models. Typical NG boxes, as you can see here. Can't get the whole thing in frame, quite obviously, because I'm at very close range. However, you can see here Eastern Airlines logo and name there, registration on the Eastern Airlines aircraft, November 309 Echo Alpha, NG Next Generation Model. There's their logo and trademark, 1/400 scale collectible models, die-cast metal. Indeed it is. Up at the top left, you've got Lockheed L-1011-1, and then in the upper right you've got L-1011 TriStar, so the name of the aircraft there nicely. Bottom panel of the box, here we can see Lockheed L-1011-1 NG, rendering of the aircraft there, and the registration yet again. Also on the main panel of the box, the front top panel, another rendering of the aircraft very nicely, obviously gear retracted in this rendering, but looks very similar to the model that you see there. So very nicely done there, NG. I like a lot. Side panel of the box here. This is a sticker from the distributor, so you can disregard that, but it does show when they got it in stock at their store. But nonetheless, 1/400 scale collectible models, die-cast metal, L-1011-1, Eastern. Back of the box, another rendering of the aircraft, the same one that you get on the top front panel, but nice detail on that. And then, of course, all the same here, some legalese things here, L-1011 and Lockheed are among trademarks owned by Lockheed. Eastern is a trademark of Eastern Airlines. Don't know who owns the rights to Eastern Airlines anymore, but apparently there is still a trademark on there. Item number 31007 for those of you keeping score at home. And then, of course, the obligatory legal warnings about the small parts. Not suitable for children under 14 years. Product of China. Yes, ages 14 plus. And then I'm assuming that here the Chinese text is talking about the same things that the English text is talking about, probably belied by the number 14 in the midst of all of that, which is incomprehensible to yours truly. Other than that, there is no opening panel on the box in terms of what you get on a Gemini model. It gives you some information about the aircraft, specs, history, that sort of thing. NG doesn't do that, but that's what you get on the Eastern version of the box. And then for the United Airlines variant, this is the 500 variant of the L-1011, so slightly different aircraft here, more or less the same, but a little bit shorter, slightly uprated engines, diminished passenger capacity in exchange for longer range. But on the NG version of that box, we have much the same as the Eastern Airlines version for the Dash 1, but this one quite obviously Lockheed L-1011-500. And then, of course, you get the same L-1011 TriStar logo in the upper right. Rendering of the aircraft here on the front top panel with gear retracted, of course. You can see that this is, in fact, a rendering of the Dash 5 because you have this slightly different shaped ramp in front of the number 2 engine nacelle here. And really, it's not a nacelle, it's an air intake. The actual engine is back here. But different design there, and you'll see that on the model as well. Lower right of the box, NG, Next Generation, TM, all of that. So basically the same box in overall design. Obviously NG, they change their box colors depending on the aircraft, depending on the model that they're doing. So they have the box reflect some motif of the livery. Quite obviously you can see a big United Airlines logo here in the center of the box behind there. But United, registration on this one, November 514 Papa Alpha. Very cool. Bottom panel of the box. Lockheed L-1011, NG, another rendering of the aircraft with the registration. Left side panel of the box, again, another lot number in terms of inventory for the distributor. And then, of course, 1/400 scale collectible model, die-cast metal, all that kind of stuff. And then the back, there's the distributor. Sprue Brothers model, same one as the Eastern model, of course. They're a great company, really, if you're trying to find these models on the internet. They've been absolutely wonderful so far. But again, all of the different NG marketing material where you can find their social media pages, and then the same disclaimer warnings here in English and Chinese. I assume that is Mandarin, but I don't really know anything about the languages of China, so please forgive me if that's incorrect. Bottom panel of the box, same deal. Rendering of the aircraft, registration, and all of that. So those are the boxes, and again, as you can see on the model here, the actual object looks quite similar to the rendering that they give you on the assorted panels of the box, so all that looks very, very nice. The Lockheed L-1011. It is, to date, the last airliner produced by Lockheed and then sold onto the public commercial market. Why, you may ask? Well, let's back up a little bit. The 1960s were a very formative time for the civil aviation industry. We had passed World War II. The world finally started to have some order amidst the perpetual chaos of general things in the world at large, and people now were feeling good again about using their money to do things with it. So, for the everyday person, that meant, hey, perhaps we can travel. And a lot of people had that thought. So, airlines started to crop up, serving general public and serving general passengers. So, what happens? We need more capacity for passengers. We also need more capacity for range. Up to this point, most civil aircraft were propeller-driven. And of course, they were directly related to the military aircraft that had been flying during the war. But as the demand for more passenger capacity increased, so did the demand for longer range, and at the same time, a demand for getting to destinations more quickly started to crop up. So what happens? Well, Germany were working on jet propulsion during the Second World War, and of course after the Second World War ended, that technology didn't just disappear. Allied forces got a hold of it, and they started to develop it, and they started to perfect it. And eventually, jet engines started to come into the civil aviation market. Aircraft like the de Havilland Comet, for example, started to become the first reasonably, in big inverted commas there, successful commercial jet airliners. However, the engine technology started to increase. This meant that the aircraft could start to fly more quickly, which cut down on travel time, at the expense of range initially, but as all technology goes, the initial ideas work, but they could be optimized, and as time goes on, things become more and more optimized. So, by the time the 1960s comes along, we now have better engines, we have better speed, we have better materials in terms of airframe construction, we have a better understanding of aerodynamics. Let's build the 747, says Boeing, and they create the largest civil jet the world had ever seen by that point. And still today, it's still the second largest civil jet the world has ever seen now in 2020. However, some of the American domestic airlines, in particular American Airlines, started to say, all right, well, we see your 747 and it's a great aircraft. However, we don't necessarily want to have to sell 450 seats every time we send a plane across the Atlantic. So why can't we have something that has similar capabilities of something like the 747, but perhaps a little bit smaller? And maybe we don't need to have 4 big engines burning all the time either. All right, so 2 companies then started to answer that call initially put out by American Airlines. They were McDonnell Douglas, and they started to design what eventually became the DC-10, and Lockheed then started to design what eventually became the L-1011. That point about 4 engines needed to go across the Atlantic, well, that was basically true at this point. Remember, jet engine technology had only really started to be invented and implemented on actual flight-worthy aircraft in the middle of the 1940s. We're now in the middle of the 1960s, and the Boeing 747 first flew in 1969, all right? So we're still kind of at the beginning of the jet age, believe it or not, even though we're only talking about 50 years ago. So, given that the technology was still relatively new and still relatively unproven, the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States, they had regulations that said no aircraft, no civil aircraft certified to carry members of the general public may fly for longer than 60 minutes relative travel time from an airport that could support a landing of that aircraft. Why was this? Well, they were trying to build in some redundancy and emergency cross-range capability in the event of engine failures, which still were not all that uncommon, relatively speaking, relative to today. And again, this is 1969, 1970 times. So they said that if you wanted to fly an aircraft away from that 60-minute threshold of any airfield that could support landing that aircraft in an emergency, you needed more than 2 engines. So aircraft like the Boeing 707 and 747 had 4 engines on them to get around this regulation. And of course, that was absolutely reasonable. However, when the airlines wanted smaller aircraft with similar capabilities of something like the 747, they want to save fuel, they want to save some money overall in terms of overall performance of the aircraft, and they also want to save that turnaround time and that extra cost associated with flying an aircraft half full, basically, in the case of selling 200 out of 400 seats on a 747. So, what do we do to get around this? Designers, McDonnell Douglas. Designers, Lockheed. Give us 3 engines. How about that? Fine. The 60-minute rule applied to aircraft that had 2 engines and 2 engines only. Therefore, if you add a third, you can get around the 60-minute rule. However, having 3 engines on an aircraft is kind of strange. It's asymmetrical, you get all kinds of imbalance issues in terms of weight distribution and all kinds of things like that. So where do you put this 3rd engine? Well, let's put it in the tail. And that's exactly what McDonnell and Lockheed did with their DC-10 and L-1011 respectively. For the L-1011, putting the engine in the tail, although not all that unconventional, especially relative to the DC-10, which was its direct competitor, putting the engine in the tail also sort of started the death knell of this aircraft before it even launched in commercial service. Lockheed, in order to optimize their aerodynamic design, only allowed one type of engine in the design of the L-1011, and that engine was the Rolls-Royce RB211. This was a brand new engine at the time, and much like everything else on the TriStar, it was a bit revolutionary. Rolls-Royce were starting to use carbon fiber and other carbon composites in the construction of the engines. It had carbon fiber impeller and compressor stages in terms of the materials that the blades were made out of inside that engine. However, this was a brand new technology, and carbon fiber really was just as unproven as the jet engine in some cases. So Rolls-Royce ran into cost overruns and massive delays in development of the RB211, which forced Rolls-Royce into bankruptcy. Now, the British Crown, recognizing the importance of Rolls-Royce as a national asset and also in terms of national heritage of the United Kingdom, they stepped in and they gave Rolls-Royce a whole bunch of government subsidies so that they could continue development of the RB211 because Lockheed were insistent on getting the L-1011 flying soon so that they could sell it to their airline customers. and the RB211 was built with funds secured from the British Crown. Finally, Lockheed, after about a year of delays, could get the L-1011 off the ground for the first time and then out into civil service with their airline customers. By this point, though, the DC-10 had already had its first flight, and it had already started deliveries to its airline customers. So right out of the gate, the L-1011, despite being arguably the better design, was at a disadvantage to the DC-10 simply because of logistical problems. And again, the problem with the RB211 in terms of Lockheed was that center engine mounted inside the actual fuselage. In order to cut down on drag and in order to cut down on those weight distribution problems, you put an engine in the tail along the center line of the aircraft. You negate the issues of having imbalanced thrust as well as center of gravity imbalances from left to right on the aircraft. However, because of the size restrictions of putting an engine completely inside the fuselage, they needed the RB211 and only the RB211. Otherwise, Lockheed would have had to redesign the airframe quite significantly to accommodate a different type of engine. Therefore, they waited, and therefore they were delayed relative to the DC-10 at launch. So, delays notwithstanding, the L-1011 eventually has its first flight on the 16th of November in 1970, eventually entering civil service first with Eastern Airlines on the 26th of April 1972. Now, we had delays with the launch of this aircraft because Lockheed were very stringent with its design. Now, why were they so stringent with its design? First of all, looking at its competitor, the DC-10, the DC-10 was a fine aircraft, although it was plagued by reliability issues and unfortunately a few accidents in the first few years after its launch. It was a fine aircraft. However, it basically was the same thing as a 707 or a 747 in terms of its overall design philosophy. It was a very conventional aircraft. It would do its job, but it was kind of no frills, and Lockheed tried to take advantage of this, trying to call the DC-10 the budget option to prospective airline customers. Again, of course, they're trying to market the L-1011. However, the L-1011's cult following, which continues to this day, there's a good reason for that. The L-1011 was an extremely advanced aircraft in terms of the technology that it employed during the day. You had the RB211 engines, which had carbon composite structures for a lot of their internal workings, as did the L-1011 itself. However, more importantly than that, just more important than the structural things of the aircraft, were its electronic capabilities. Remember, this is 1960s technology, with the L-1011 taking its first flight in 1970, so we're 50 years ago. The L-1011 had the capacity to fly itself entirely, from takeoff all the way through to landing. The aircraft was one of the first civil jets rated for Category 3C auto landing, so that meant that this aircraft could land itself autonomously via the autopilot system in conditions of zero visibility. So that's nighttime on dark airfields, that's zero visibility due to weather, whatever the situation is, the L-1011 can land itself automatically. 50 years ago. The aircraft also had a system called Direct Lift Control, or DLC. And what this did was, rather than manage rate of ascent or descent via changes in pitch, what the autopilot system had the capacity to do was to deploy slats, flaps, and spoilers automatically depending on what the desired approach angle was in terms of glide slope to the runway, or desired rate of ascent or descent relative to a cruising altitude set for increase or decrease. And it could do all of this autonomously on the fly with the aircraft's guidance system reacting in real time and completely autonomously to command different control inputs, extend and retract flaps, spoilers, leading edge slats, things like that. And again, all of this 50 years ago. These are systems that are similar to what happens nowadays with systems like MCAS for the Boeing, or other systems that are imposed by Airbus and employed by Airbus in terms of how the aircraft will fly within its flight envelope at a given operating speed or altitude or air pressure or winds, things like that. The L-1011 was doing that 50 years ago. All kinds of brand new cutting edge technology for its day, and it's still pretty sophisticated now. It is only now in the 2020s where that is now an expected feature in an airliner. The L-1011 was doing that in 1970. and it was very complicated. Pilots needed some time to learn how to use these systems effectively, but from what I have read, once people did understand how to operate these aircraft, they absolutely loved all of these systems. It made their jobs a lot easier, but at the same time, the aircraft was such a sound design that when it was under complete manual control, they loved the handling characteristics. It had great power and great performance. It could climb and dive well. It turned well. It had plenty of agility. Absolutely wonderful in terms of what the flight crews say about the L-1011s. The story was similar for passengers as well. The aircraft is a wide-body airliner, of course, and it, of course, could take advantage of that wide-body architecture. On the launch spec, the Dash 1 L-1011, and our Eastern Airlines aircraft is a Dash 1 L-1011, you had 256 passengers in terms of your overall seating capacity on this aircraft, with an exit limit of 400 in terms of getting this aircraft evacuated in an emergency. So the airframe is not being stressed really at all in terms of its overall capacity, but it meant that the L-1011 could support then some amenities for the passengers. You had big seats, you had wide aisles, you had in-flight entertainment, of course. You had a galley on board this aircraft on the lower deck, which was serviced by elevators. Yes, elevators on board an airplane for passenger and crew use. How about that? On some models of the L-1011, there was even a lower deck lounge or rest area for passengers and crew to use. So we've got ourselves some pretty cool systems. Because of where that center engine is, though, mounted in the tail, you then did have to have some of those real compromises in terms of the interior layout with putting the galley on the lower deck and things like that. But they tried to use that to their advantage, and it worked out very nicely. It was really a novel setup for an aircraft, and passengers and crew alike appreciated it. In terms of overall specifications, though, the Dash 1 spec first, initial launch price of $20 million in $1972. The Dash 1 first flew on the 16th of November 1970, entering service with Eastern Airlines on April 26, 1972, with the last unit being delivered on March 7, 1983. A total of 157 of the Dash 1 variant in the L-1011 were produced, all running the Rolls-Royce RB211-22 jet engine, producing 187,000 newtons of thrust at sea level. On the 100 spec, the aircraft length is 177 feet 8.5 inches. The height is 55 feet 4 inches, and that's from the bottom of the main gear to the top of the tail. The outer width of the fuselage, 19 feet 7 inches. The inner width of the cabin, 18 feet 11 inches. So that's the habitable volume inside the aircraft. Wingspan on the Dash 1, 155 feet 4 inches with a total wing area of 3,456 square feet. Obviously, we talked about the seating arrangement. The Dash 1 had 256 passengers on most nominal seating configurations. Maximum takeoff weight, 430,000 pounds. Total fuel capacity of 23,814 U.S. gallons. Cruising speed, 0.9 Mach, 956 kilometers per hour. Very, very good specs in terms of performance. Remember, in 1970, service ceiling on the Dash 1 spec, 42,000 feet with a range of 4,250 nautical miles. So it's a medium-range airliner at this point in terms of being the Dash 1, but not too bad, all things considered. The United liveried L-1011 that we have here, this is a Dash 500, and this is the latest and last variant of the L-1011. The overall cost of a launch spec L-1011 500 in 2020 dollars, $200 million. So again, you can adjust for inflation if you so desire. Maiden flight of the Dash 500 was the 16th of October 1978, with British Airways being their first customer. Final delivery of the Dash 500 was the 3rd of October 1983, so really it was being produced alongside the Dash 1 specification almost the entire time that it was built. Only 50 examples of the Dash 500, though, were ever built. The engines remained the Rolls-Royce RB211, but a slightly developed variant thereof, that is the Dash 524B specification. Total thrust uprated a little bit from the Dash 1, 222,000 newtons of thrust at sea level. Aircraft length slightly shorter than the Dash 1 spec, this one 164 feet 2.5 inches long. This was a compromise made to increase the range significantly of the aircraft. They also added a couple extra fuel tanks. The height remains 55 feet 4 inches, the outer width of the fuselage remains 19 feet 7 inches, and the cabin interior width remains 18 feet 11 inches. Wingspan on the Dash 500 increased a bit from the Dash 1, 164 feet 4 inches wingspan on the Dash 500 versus 155 feet 4 inches on the Dash 1. Wing area therefore increases proportionally to 3,541 square feet. Typical seating arrangement on the Dash 500, we are down by 10 seats relative to the Dash 1, 246 seats on the Dash 500 with an exit limit of 330. However, we are still nowhere near the theoretical maximum capacity of the airframe. Maximum takeoff weight on the Dash 5, 510,000 pounds relative to the 430,000 pounds of the Dash 1, so we've got improvements there. Fuel capacity also greatly increased over the Dash 1, 31,642 US gallons fuel capacity on the Dash 5. Cruising speed remains 0.9 Mach. However, range greatly increased. We had 4,250 nautical miles on the Dash 1, 6,090 nautical miles on the Dash 500. So there was the improvement that Lockheed needed. Finally, they did truly have a wide-body, long-range airliner in the Dash 500 spec of the L-1011. Unfortunately, it was too little too late because the DC-10 really did eat up the market share by that point in 1983. However, the L-1011 was a very good aircraft, and people, as we said before, continue to sing its praises pretty much constantly in aviation circles. It was a very unique aircraft, and to this day it is the last civil jet put into major commercial service that's manufactured by a company other than Boeing or Airbus. The last wide-body, long-haul, civil jet, not made by Boeing or Airbus. So that's a pretty cool distinction, and of course it's made by Lockheed, who have a very illustrious history of building military aircraft and spacecraft and things like that, so not too bad at all. Unfortunately, there is, as far as I'm aware, only one L-1011 that is still flying today, and that is actually doing something very, very cool. The Orbital Sciences Corporation, they fly an L-1011, and they use it as an airborne launch vehicle for carrier rockets. The Pegasus carrier rockets, an orbital-class carrier rocket that is air-launched from the belly of an L-1011, and it takes satellites into low Earth orbit. So there is still an L-1011 flying today. It's called Stargazer, but it is a modified L-1011, and it launches rockets. So as far as I know, that is the last L-1011 that is still in active service. The other ones have now been either consigned to museums or have been broken up for scrap, rather unfortunately. But there is still at least one L-1011 that is still actively flying. There are a couple other ones that were flying with the British Royal Air Force. They were troop transport and fuel tankers. I believe that they're still in mothballs at the moment. Theoretically, they could be restored to active service, but at the moment I'm not aware of any plans to do so. I believe that the Dutch Air Force also flew L-1011s. I don't know if they still are. I do not believe that they are. But yes, still L-1011s kind of with us today, but none in civil service any longer. Now to take a look at these two models for their sake of being models. NG, they do a spectacular job on their L-1011s, and really pretty much every other aircraft that they make as well, but the L-1011 in particular, they really got this one right in terms of the mold shape. Looks absolutely wonderful, and if I had some better backdrops here, you might be hard-pressed to tell that we're not looking at an actual aircraft, depending on the angles that we were showing. However, here, this is the L-1011-1, so the launch spec L-1011 here with the Eastern livery on it. You can see that they have done absolutely wonderful work here. You can see, first of all, the overall shape of the nose looks right. The nose landing gear there, it's very intricate, very spindly, but it looks like the prototype, very nice. And then, of course, you can start to see the main gear as well back there, slightly out of frame in terms of the left main gear for the moment. But very nice. You can see the livery details here. We've got the Eastern logo and branding across the forward section of the fuselage there. We've got one of our cabin entry doors forward, and then we've got our midship entry doors. We have got the flag of the United States here. Very cool. We have got an abbreviated registration number here just under the nose, 309er, and then of course moving aft we're going to have another full registration there. You can just start to see it here, November 309er Echo Alpha. So there you go, very nice. The left wing of the aircraft here, you can see nice details across the leading edge of the left wing. As we refocus, there we go. So very nice wing root, and then leading edge, it thins out as you move outboard, and then one of the RB211 engines right here. It's mounting pylon and nacelle, and inside there you can see that we do have the fan blades of the RB211 replicated nicely. Completely static, as this is 1/400 scale, but very nicely done all around here on what is the port side or left side of the aircraft. But I do like the shape of the nose on the L-1011, and I think they did a nice job of it. You can see that we have got wipers up here printed on there in terms of the graphics. Everything looking very, very prim and proper on this one, I must say. Very, very nicely done. Forward up here you can see we've got an antenna. That looks right, and it's a nice sharply done thing. It's not loose in any way. It doesn't move around. Very nice. Unfortunately, sometimes you do get these antennas which are not secured very well on some of these models, but not the case with this NG L-1011. Side on here from the port side. Taking a look here, you can see once again the great graphics that we talked about. Toward the nose section, you can see that we have got some vents cut underneath the forward windows here along the silver section of the fuselage. That looks nice. Better look now from the side of the nose landing gear. That looks good. And then moving aft, you can see all of these wonderful details as we start to move across the fuselage. There is that secondary entrance door on the aircraft. Are we going to focus again? Does not appear at this range. There we go. There right now you can see, yes, that secondary door with the US flag looks nice. And then the wing root and the wing leading edge out to the wing tip with the red strobe on the left hand side. Looks very, very nice. Main landing gear, will we focus on it? We're going to try. Nope, we got to zoom out a little bit. Yes, so main landing gear again, that's rubber tires on plastic wheels. So again, real rubber, looks very nice, and they roll very freely as well. So the model is easy to move around once you do have it out of the box and on the ground. Registration November 309er Echo Alpha, and then our aft doors there. I believe the aftmost door, that is an emergency exit only, I believe. But you can see the door forward of that would be another place where passengers could, in theory, get out. Air stairs, though, would have to be used there. The retractable gates probably would not be able to maneuver around the wing. Empennage area of the aircraft, and you can see as we start to move the camera upward, we have got our elevators and horizontal stabilizers in the tail. And then as we move up, you can see the S-duct here, the intake air for the number 2 engine, passing through this point here, and then it passes through an S-shaped channel into the engine right down here. So the engine is almost entirely mounted inside the fuselage. All of this up here, this structure is just an air intake. It's a snorkel, if you will, and it follows an S-shaped trajectory down into the engine air intake. It's not as efficient to feed an engine through an S-duct like this. However, it was more efficient than trying to mount this engine completely externally to the aircraft. Thereby, the increase in aerodynamic efficiency that they were able to get by placing the engine inside the fuselage, it outweighed the inefficiencies that the engine itself started to run into by having a slightly restricted air supply. So it all balanced out in the end. Moving up further, you can see the vertical stabilizer and tail and rudder assembly there. You can see that we have some shut lines here where the rudder control surface would be. Looks very good, and gotta say, NG doing a nice job here with their mold in terms of the details. Moving downward once again, you can see that we have got the number 2 engine detail here. It's not just all cast in die-cast metal. This is a plastic part, and they've actually bothered to put them in here to show more detail on the engine. Looks very nice. You can see here back on the number 2 engine intake that Eastern Airlines, they painted whisper liner on the sides of their aircraft. Why did they do that? Well, the L-1011 was a very quiet plane, both on the ground in terms of externally as well as on board. The cabin noise was actually not all that bad. It was quieter than its competitors, and that's very interesting considering that there actually was an engine mounted inside the fuselage. So that's very nice, and of course they used that to marketing prowess, did Eastern Airlines. So Whisperliner was one of their informal designations for the L-1011s that they had in their fleet. Very, very nice. And also, before we move on to the United variant of the aircraft, a note about this particular model here, at least the prototypical aircraft that is the subject of this model, November 309er Echo Alpha, actually was involved in an incident. It was flying as Eastern Airlines Flight 935 on September 22, 1981, when the aircraft suffered an uncontained engine failure in the number 2 engine, so that tail engine right there. When the engine came apart, they were flying at about 10,000 feet, having taken off from Kennedy Airport in New York City, and the debris from the failing engine severed 3 out of the 4 onboard hydraulic systems. Thankfully, Lockheed, having experience with military aircraft, built in a lot of redundancy in the important systems that were needed to keep the aircraft in flight. So they were able still to use most of the control surfaces on board. They were able to control their course in terms of their heading via differential thrust from the remaining outboard engines with the center engine down. And they were able to bring this aircraft back to a safe emergency landing back at Kennedy Airport. The flight had been en route from Newark Airport in Newark, New Jersey. They were going to Luis Muñoz Marin International Airport in San Juan, Puerto Rico. However, the failure meant that they had to divert to Kennedy not long after their takeoff from Newark, and everybody on board survived unhurt. No injuries, no losses of airframes. The aircraft was later repaired and put back into service. So, yep, just a little Easter egg in terms of the actual lineage of the subject of this model in particular. Now taking a look at the United Airlines variant of the L-1011 here in my collection. This is the Dash 500, so this is the last version of the L-1011 to be produced. More or less, you can see that it looks basically the same as the Dash 1 specification. However, we do have slight differences. We have slightly different appearances of the engine nacelles here on the wing-mounted engines. Of course, these are still the RB211s, but they were slightly updated as Rolls-Royce got better at producing these engines and understood where they could further optimize the design. The wings are effectively the same. They are ever so slightly wider here, though, on the 500 variant, as well as differences in the design of the air intake for the number 2 engine. Here you can see on the 500 variant we have got ourselves a little ramp just forward of the air intake on that number 2 engine. Therefore, this is one of the most distinctive ways in which you can differentiate a Dash 1 from a Dash 500 L-1011. But overall, it is the same design in terms of what the aircraft looks like macrocosmically. Very nice here. This one in the United Airlines livery looks very nice. Taking a look here toward the nose, and you can see that we've got very similar and just as high quality graphics on the nose section of this L-1011 as we did on the other one. Of course, both of these being NG models, you would expect them to be very, very similar to one another. But there you go. Looks very nice, and you can see all the graphics there on the nose, in addition to the nose landing gear. Again, plastic wheels with rubber tires. They work very nicely. They roll very smoothly, no problems. There is the same antenna forward here on the aircraft as we had on the other one. That looks good. United logo there, and then, of course, the Jeet lines with the windows and all of that printed onto the side of the fuselage. There are the engine nacelles and the left wing coming toward us, and you can see very nice details as well. On the lower side of the aircraft, you can see that we have this red antenna down here on the lower side. Just approaching that there. It's slightly out of focus, but you can see that we have a red antenna on the belly of the aircraft, and that all looks good. There you go, coming into sharper view now. Very nice. And of course, we have our main landing gear down there. Got some light in that area. Very nice. And again, plastic wheels and rubber tires. Moving aft, you can see that we have the aircraft's registration, November 514 Papa Alpha. Very nice. I believe this aircraft flew for, obviously, United, and it also flew for Delta before it was retired, and I believe sold off for scrap. But there you go. toward the rear of the aircraft again. Your air intake that we mentioned for the number 2 engine, as well as the empennage back there, horizontal stabilizer and elevators. And then, of course, number 2 engine itself, mounted in this section of the fuselage, looking very good there. And then the engine exhaust out the back. Looks very, very nice. Tail geometry there, with your shut line for the rudder. Very cool. Very nicely done once again here by NG on both of these models. Absolutely no problems whatsoever with either one. I think they are very true to the original real-world prototype. And definitely, if you're a fan of the L-1011, I think you should have these in your collection. Absolutely could recommend these. No problems, in my view, with either one of them. They look absolutely wonderful, and they're well made. And again, they are basically entirely die-cast. The only plastic components on these models are the engine nacelles, the landing gear, and that's basically it. The antennas are plastic as well, but everything else is die-cast. The wings are die-cast, the fuselage is die-cast, everything is basically die-cast where it matters, so it all looks very, very nice. Nose-on view of the Dash 500 variant. I definitely do like the way that that looks. I also like the detail that we have on the engine fan blades. Looks very, very nice, and of course the Dash 1 also has the same details there. Moving up a little bit, you can see the geometry of the S duct inside there, the air intake for the number 2 engine. That looks right. Very good. The only thing I will point out in terms of a production issue perhaps on this is that number 2 engine air intake. We can get focus on it. The camera doesn't really like this at the moment. Can we improve? Not so much. We're right at the limit of what it can do. But if we pull out a little more, you'll probably be able to see, yes, now we can. Inside the air inlet here, there is a little bit of, I'm not sure if it's overpainting or if there was some sort of chemical reaction with the actual metal, because the air intake is also metal. And you can just see that there are these little, almost cilia sorts of things that are inside the air intake on this side, on the left side of the intake, and they're not on the right side of the intake. So that's interesting, but they don't really cause a problem. Of course, there would be no visible engine fan in this section because the engine is mounted quite below and aft of the intake, but just wondering what that is. Not even sure if you'll be able to see it, but it's there. I haven't gone in there to try to scrape it out or whatever because I don't know if it's attached to the rest of the paint someplace, and it would be more noticeable if I tried to remove it. But it's there. It's not on the Eastern Airlines Dash 1 variant. It's only here on the United aircraft, but it is what it is. But again, I can't really complain too much because, again, they've done an absolutely wonderful job everywhere else on both of these models. Look from the rear at the Dash 1. I do like the view that you get from this angle. It looks pretty dramatic, I gotta say. And as we play with the lighting, perhaps you will see different details start to come up from the underside of the aircraft. And of course, we've got ourselves the number 2 engine exhaust right through there. That looks very nice. I like all of that. I also just really like the shape of that duct from the rear. It looks pretty different. It almost looks like the intake snorkel on some open-wheel race cars from actually this era as well. I remember a Formula 1 team called Ligier ran a car with a very large air intake on top of the engine, and it looked somewhat like that from certain angles, so that's pretty interesting. Some cross-referencing there between the disciplines, but yeah, very cool. And again, I like, particularly on that number 2 engine exhaust, where they have actually bothered to put different components inside there in terms of physically different items to show more detail of the engine. So I like all of that. They could have cheaped out on that very easily, but they didn't, and it all looks quite nice. So there it was, the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar by NG Models, here in 1/400th scale. Really, every review that I have seen, either in video form on YouTube or articles that people have written about these models, they heap praise upon them, and I have to say, I echo those sentiments entirely. These models look absolutely wonderful. They seem very true to life in terms of the overall shape and proportion of the real-world prototype aircraft. And in terms of expanding your model aviation collection, either 1-400 or 1-200, the L-1011 is a wonderful subject. I don't know if any 1-200 scale variants currently on the market of the L-1011, but in 1-400, obviously they do exist. NG, in my opinion, does the best one. Gemini jets also have done renditions of the L-1011. I don't have one of those, otherwise I would be showing you one, but from what I've seen, picture-wise, it looks like the NG version is superior to the Gemini jets. So again, these are out there, they are available, and if you want an L-1011, I definitely recommend the NG variant thereof. In terms of why you would want a model like this in your collection, well, the historical significance is plainly evident. The L-1011 was a fantastic aircraft. It was groundbreaking for its time, and it still employed some features that would be current nowadays. Aside from all of that, it's a very distinctive design as well. It's a tri-jet. Not too many tri-jets existed, and basically no tri-jets remain in service today. The MD-11, the DC-10, they remain in service mainly nowadays as freight aircraft, but the tri-jet era, it was this brief time at the end of the 60s through the mid-80s where they were trying to get around those ETOPS regulations. Unfortunately now, tri-jets basically have gone the way of the dodo bird, as has the L-1011, but there are still a couple L-1011s in service. There's one that does really cool things in spaceflight. There are a couple in mothball service with the Royal Air Force of the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, none of them in passenger revenue service today. But for a subject of a model aircraft, the L-1011, it really doesn't get too much better than that. The historical provenance is there, and even the current provenance in terms of being the only civil jet that launches spacecraft. Yes, that's a really cool thing. It was a favorite of pilots, it was a favorite of flight crews, and it was a favorite of passengers during its time in active civil service. The L-1011, it remains a cult favorite among aviation fans the world over, and certainly I have to call myself a member of that crowd. Very distinctive aircraft, and as I said at the beginning, probably the best all-around civil jet that the world had ever seen. Unfortunately, it was a victim of its own success, its innovative properties in terms of the design, and therefore its restrictions in terms of only running one specific type of engine. It meant for delays in getting the aircraft out into service, and unfortunately those delays meant that it was eclipsed commercially by McDonnell Douglas and the DC-10. But there it is, the L-1011 by Lockheed, rendered here in 1/400 scale by NG models. Absolutely wonderful. Definitely recommend this one. If you're in the market for an L-1011, take a close look for these out there. They are still available from many retailers online, so you will get them delivered to your door in 7 to 10 business days. Absolutely splendid. Until next time, though, I do thank you all very much for watching. Ferrari Man 601 saying thanks, and of course, we will see you soon.